Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 17 of the Argument Clinic podcast. My name is Martin, and I'm joined by my lovely co-host, Lawrence. How are you doing, Lawrence?
I'm doing pretty well. How about yourself?
I am doing splendid. Or is it splendidly? If you do splendid, does that mean you take splendid and you do it to something else? Is that what it means to do splendid?
I have no idea.
Good. So we are the Argument Clinic podcast, a podcast dedicated to the fundamentals of Lincoln Douglas debate. Whether you're a grizzled and or seasoned veteran of the tournament scene, whether you are attending your very first tournament on this new topic, whether you are a coach looking to gain information for your team to help coach them, whether you're an Arctic penguin listening to this podcast to get information about the cultural exchange program. It's a debate that you're certainly about to do. This is the podcast for you. So we have a special guest that we'll introduce later on in the podcast. But for now, let's talk about where in the world were Martin and Lawrence. Lawrence, where have you been these past 2 weeks, my friend?
Let's see. What last weekend was Marx and Bronx? Was that it?
Yesterday was not Marx and Bronx. But
The weekend before that. Okay, so the weekend before that was Marx, and then I just got back from the Heritage Hall tournament in Oklahoma.
So what is Marx, quote unquote?
Or the St. Mark's tournament.
You shot people? You marked them? You shot some marks?
I did not. It is the St. Mark's Heart of Texas Invitational, which was also the same weekend that our college played Texas in the infamous OU Texas game. So our hotel was flooded with Texas fans. And as you can imagine, being an OU student, I wasn't very happy about that.
Do you manifest any emotions whatsoever about OU sports?
No, I just don't like Texas.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay, so Lawrence went to 2 debate tournaments. I also went to 2 debate tournaments. I went to a small local tournament this past Saturday. Actually, I didn't go to 2 tournaments. I stayed home the weekend of the Bronx High School of Science Invitational Tournament. Although I nervously awaited on the sidelines, and one of my debaters won the tournament, and then some other ones did well. So that was a great weekend. But I was just it was if I was there, I was stressing out just like I was, except I wasn't there. I was just at home doing it. But it was fun. It was good to have a quote unquote week off. All right. So before we get into the substance of things, this podcast is sponsored by Victory Briefs. The Victory Briefs Institute is one of the most premier debate camps in the United States. It has some of the best instructors in the United States and some of the best competition, so you can hone your game as well. It's very easy to find a bad debate camp in this country. There are just tons of camps that are associated with colleges and things like that, and it's easy for them to be like, we have this random person that did LD one time, and they will teach you. And usually those programs are wastes of money. I wouldn't go so far as to say that they're scams, but they're pretty bad. With Victory Briefs, you know exactly what you're getting, and it's excellence. Victory Briefs is one of the premier camps in the country, and honestly, I highly recommend visiting it for all of your summer debate needs. Lawrence is affiliated with Victory Briefs, and he loves it very much, right, Lawrence?
Yeah, sure.
Deeply. Yeah. Okay, so Victory Briefs helps sponsor our podcast. They help keep the lights running. They do a bunch of technical stuff with us that ensures that we can stay on the air and direct to you all. So Victory Briefs is great. All right. So this week we have a scholarship episode. We have the topic analysis episode for the November-December topic. These podcast episodes are almost always the most popular, and they're the most directly relevant to you all. We're going to try to get this one out before many of you all's first tournament. I know that my school has a tournament just this upcoming weekend. Lawrence, do any schools that you're coaching have sort of imminent tournaments? I imagine just a few weeks now.
Yeah. So there's Notre Dame and Minneapolis, which I think you're also going to.
I will. Yes.
Oh, sweet. Isn't that where we first met to discuss making this podcast?
Yeah. It was. Okay. So yeah, scholarship episode. We have a special mystery guest that you already know the name of because you looked at the episode notes. Don't look. No, that's cheating. Mystery guest, and So today we're going to get into all the ins and outs of the November-December Lincoln-Douglas resolution. And when we get back, we'll introduce our mystery guest and get right down to it. All right, I'd like to welcome our special guest, Joie Otting. How are you, Joie?
I'm doing fantastic.
Fantastic. Fantastic is fantastic. I think that's the best word, Lawrence, that anyone's ever used to describe themselves on this podcast. Is that, do you agree? I assume you keep a meticulous list of all of the adjectives people have used.
I do not. So
I love it. Fantastic. Fantastic is great. Okay. So Joie, I gather that you debated in Iowa, right? What high school did you go to?
I went to Dowling Catholic.
Dowling Catholic in Iowa. You won multiple state championships, I'm pretty sure.
I sure did.
You sure did. That's awesome. And you also won the junior varsity Glenbrooks tournament, which is coming up for many people and what a lot of people. Yeah, go ahead.
I absolutely did do that in 2014.
That's awesome. I didn't have any experiences with the JV tournament, but my second year I attended the Glenbrooks tournament and went 2-5. Is that as good as winning the tournament?
Sure.
Sure. Oh well, that's okay. Thank you for trying to salvage some self-esteem on my part. But yeah, so we're super excited to have Joie on. She knows all about this resolution. She's looking actually to coach people for the upcoming Glenbrooks tournament. So we'll talk about that at the end of the podcast. But if you are at all, if you listen to this episode and you think that Joie has a lot to contribute and you may want her as kind of a private coach situation for this topic or something else, we'll talk about that later. But you can send us an email at the archimedespodcast@gmail.com and we'll get all that stuff squared away. Okay, so first part of every topic analysis episode is we talk about what the resolution, kind of like what it means generally to get a handle on the resolution. Then in our next section, we'll talk about some affirmative arguments and how you would answer them, and then some negative arguments, how we answer them. And when we wrap up, we'll talk about, we'll have our conclusion, and the only important section of our podcast at all, which is the mini debate. And Joy will be able to be a deciding vote on that one. All right. So the resolution is, Lawrence, would you mind reading the resolution for all of our lovely listeners?
Wealthy nations have an obligation to provide development assistance to other nations.
Wealthy nations have an obligation to provide development assistance to other nations. Okay. So wealthy nations have an obligation to provide development assistance to other nations. So overall, before we get into some of these exact words that we're using, Joie, what sort of more or less is this resolution about? And what I mean by that is, we can debate for a long time about what it means for a nation to be wealthy, what it means to be a nation to be another nation. But like, what is the main kind of question that the resolution is asking us in your eyes?
Should nations help other nations, basically?
Should nations help other nations, presumably like with their economy or something?
Yeah, generally, although I definitely think there's an argument to be made about things other than the economy, but we can get into that later.
As well we shall. Yes, overall, it's should we help other people, and specifically, should we get in with their economies to make sure that they're all better. So let's go through some of the terms on the resolution as we normally do one by one. So first word in the resolution, wealthy. So wealthy, Lawrence. So do you think that the resolution means wealthy in the sense of like a rich kind of cultural wealth? Or do you think it means wealthy in the sense of like dollars? Because I can be like, oh, like you're rich in spirit or whatever. But that's not what the resolution's about, right? It's about like dollars. Yeah.
Just dollar signs.
So what kind of countries, Joey, do you think of when you think of like wealthy nations?
Generally developed countries or Western countries like the US and Canada, UK, like European countries and that general kind of thing.
Yeah, definitely. We think of Western European countries, and the United States most of the time. There are some interesting corner cases, like is China a wealthy nation? It's like, there's some back and forth on that one. And then obviously not every country in Europe is rich, or wealthy. You could say, for example, that Greece and Spain, because their economies collapsed, are definitely not. I do want to get to a word that you use, Joey, which is developing nations. And I think that a lot of the literature in this resolution uses that phrase of like developing versus developed nations. And correct me if I'm wrong, Joey, but like the basic idea behind a developing nation versus a developed nation is like developing nations are kind of like already done, their economies are kind of in place, and they kind of just happen and they work over time as you just leave them there. Whereas developing countries don't have all those things going for them, and we need to put them in a position where they are. So they're getting an economy like in the future or something like that.
Yeah, I'd say that's a pretty accurate description.
Yeah, so most of the time, wealthy nations and developed nations are going to be very similar. So when you all are like doing research, developing nations are good. Next word, nations. So we already talked about the developing versus developed stuff. A nation, can we just assume that that's countries for the sake of the resolution? Like, for example, do you think that we could start talking about the Navajo Nation? No, right? I mean, like, what the resolution really means is countries, right?
Yeah, I'd say so.
Lawrence, what do you think?
Yeah, just countries.
Yeah, okay, great. Well, that one was easy. So next word. So the resolution doesn't say ought, and we have most of our resolutions have said ought up to this point. This resolution says have an obligation. So it's important to note, Lawrence, that this resolution does not say moral obligation. It just says obligation. Do you think that will change many of the debates that will happen on this topic?
It potentially could, but I don't think it ought to. So like,
why not?
I mean, yeah, I guess you could debate about whether or not there's some sort of legal obligation or some obligation laid out in some treaty somewhere to provide development assistance, but I think that's just boring debate, and it's really like not exactly what LD is about, which is like, is there a moral obligation to provide development assistance?
Is that the argument that you should make in the debate? Be like, my opponent's case is boring.
I'd be convinced by it.
Fair enough. Basically, the idea is that a lot of obligations, even if they're not quote unquote moral obligations, are kind of like moral obligations in disguise, though, right? I mean, like if I'm like, we have a government obligation, like why? Under what basis? Normally, it comes to morality, anyways. So really, like, this whole obligation stuff, I mean, like, it looks fancy, but honestly, like, it's probably not going to change debates much. Normally it'll just be the same old stuff about justice
versus morality.
Slash morality. Yeah. Yeah. I think you could have some values of justice on this resolution for sure. With some of the affirmative arguments that we'll talk about. Okay. Kind of blazing through these at lightning speed, because we have to get to some more complicated affirmative and negative arguments. Let's talk about provide. So is there anything you all have to say about this word? I mean, what does it mean to provide development assistance? That just means you have to try, right? You just have to like try and give them money.
Well, I don't think you try and give them money. I think you just give them money or development assistance.
Yeah, I just want to, and let's not spend too much time on this, but I wanted to get to one kind of like central idea, which is, so it would not be reasonable for the affirmative to make the following argument. The affirmative could say, the resolution only actually comes up if they actually get their development assisted. Because the resolution says provide development assistance, maybe like provide means like they got it. So, that means the countries, by definition in the resolution, are developed as a result of the affirmative. That's not what this means, right?
Yeah, so my guess is the affirmative gets to assume that the development assistance does reach those countries and like not have to deal with maybe some of these countries are slightly corrupt and that sort of implicates their ability to effectively provide development assistance. But I'm not so sure the affirmative gets just to assume that development assistance is successful at achieving development or assisting development or whatever you want to say.
Yeah, how do you feel about this, Joey? Do you basically agree with Lawrence or something else?
Yeah, I agree with that.
Okay, cool. So we're kind of getting through most of the other things in the resolution. And in fact, I kind of just want to skip down to the last words in the resolution, which are other nations, so we can spend a bit more time than normal talking about development assistance, which is by far the most important part of the topic. Okay, other nations. So other nations refers, so other nations is contrasted with wealthy nations. I think that's kind of like a reasonable thing to assume. So does other mean poor? And if we're talking about wealthy meaning developed, does other nations mean developing nations?
Yeah.
Joey, what do you think?
I would say, like, based on a reasonable interpretation of the resolution, that would be the case. But I could definitely see people trying to make the argument that a wealthy nation is the actor and they just have to give to another nation, and it doesn't matter if that nation is wealthy or not, since the resolution doesn't specifically, I guess, specify.
What do you think, Lawrence? I agree with most of what you said, Joey.
Yeah, same.
Yeah.
You don't get to, US does not get to give money to Canada because it's not providing development assistance.
Yeah, that's true. I also even think that, like, as an academic point, this is like sort of half interesting, but I also think that like no one's actually gonna make the argument, right? I mean, like, I don't think it would even be that good if the United States gave money to Canada. like that wouldn't do anything, right? I mean, like if the United States was like, hey, like, hey Canada, like try and become more democratic. Here's $1 billion. You know, just be like, thanks? Question mark. Like, kind of don't need this. What's the beef? Like, I don't get it. Yeah, I don't think people are going to do this. I don't even think there's much of an advantage to try. Is kind of what I'm saying.
I agree. I don't think it's a very strategic argument to make.
So for all relevant cases, developing nations, wealthy nations refers to developed nations. Okay, let's talk development assistance. So Joey, development of what? What are we developing? This is kind of like a broad question, because we're really developing like a lot of different kinds of stuff. But like to not necessarily just like give me a list, but just like what does development mean? How should I be thinking about whether or not a nation is developed or not? And what is the development of a nation?
I would say generally it's going to be giving another nation money in order to help them to like expand their economy and hopefully ultimately become more independent and more able to run their economy like without external aid.
Yeah, I think that that's a very good synopsis of development. You want to improve their economy, and I really loved how you said that you kind of to get them in a situation where they can try and run it themselves. That's really what development is. You know, Lawrence, there's a sense in which the word development here is kind of like the same talking about a kid, like the development of a kid. It's kind of like a weird metaphor, but it is kind of the same, right? I mean, what you're doing is you're taking a nation that is quote unquote undeveloped. You know, they do not resemble other nations in the international system because they don't have the appropriate systems of governance. They can't run their own economies and things like that. And you put them in a position where they develop on their own, kind of get independence and the ability to do that. Is that kind of like the same, or am I crazy?
I mean,
so it's kind
weird,
of like
but
how my parents are helping me pay for college, basically.
Right. Yeah. Like it's so that they help you so you can get yourself in a position to be independent in the future.
Exactly.
And I do think that kind of it is kind of a weird, when you think about it too much, it is kind of like a weird, and I am thinking about it too much. It is a little bit of a strange way of thinking about governments. Like, because when you think of development versus undevelopment, you're kind of thinking of like better or worse, but you're also thinking of like kind of like a government is less of a version of itself, if that makes sense. Like a caterpillar is not yet a butterfly. Like it will eventually transform into a butterfly. And I think that's kind of the metaphor with development assistance. It's kind of like you are incomplete as a country and you need to like become more complete and like more like us, like the rest of the world. I don't know. All right. Snap vote from YouTube. Martin's crazy. Yes or no?
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, good. But everyone already knew that, so no points for you. Okay, let's talk about some specific things that development assistance can assist with. Oh, wait, one other thing. So, Joey, you mentioned aid. So let's talk about, before we get into like the specific things that you can develop, let's talk about how development assistance is usually administered. Most development assistance is in the form of, you think, aid. So here's a question for you, Lawrence. If I just gave you, let's say I donated $50 billion to Zambia. Just that's all I did. Is that development assistance?
No, for a few reasons. First is like no one would ever do that. But second, well, it's a bit that would be most similar to humanitarian aid, which is a short-term cash infusion into a country, whereas development aid is meant to ensure a country's sustainable growth over the long run. So a single donation of $50 would not constitute development aid. And also, unless that $50 was explicitly used for the purposes of growing their economy or promoting their welfare development, it would also not be development aid.
Okay, so I'm going to stop you a little bit there, and I'm going to like slightly criticize the use of some of your language. So you said that it wouldn't be development assistance unless the country used it for the purpose of development.
Well, it's direct, yeah. So it has to be sent to people for
But
the
that's not
purposes
quite right? Yeah. So sorry, what were you saying?
Well, so why is it not quite right?
Because it's not whether they use it for assistance. It's not whether they use it for development.
Yeah, so the technical definition by like whatever place decided to like come up with an official definition is that it is administered with the promotion of the economic development of welfare of developing countries as its main objective. So
yeah, exactly, right. So it's not that they ended up using it for development. It's that the reason you gave it to them was for development.
Yeah.
By the way, for the listeners, what is that definition that you just read?
Good question. It's from, I think, the OECD.
The OECD. Okay. And that's the Organization on Economic Council Development? There's no way that's right.
Yeah,
Maybe,
that's not right.
Maybe there's some okay.
It's the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development.
Cooperation, I was so close. Okay. Okay, so it has to be given for the purpose of doing it. So if I gave someone $50,000, or sorry, $50 billion, and then I was just thinking in my head, like, I want them to use this to develop their country. Like, that's probably maybe development assistance, right? Maybe.
Maybe.
Here's the question, and maybe I can switch to Joey for this one. Joey, when you give aid to a country, does that aid, in order to be development assistance, have to be conditional? And what I mean by conditional is, do you have to say, we will give you this money only if you use it for development? Or are you allowed to give someone money and then them have choice over whether or not they can spend that money to increase development? But you just like wanted them to increase development.
I would say in order for it to be developmental assistance, it would need to actually be used for development. And then it's just a matter of like what it means for it to be used for development versus it being used for something else. Because it seems like there's an argument to be made that a lot of different things could be using it for development. And it seems like if you're giving money to a country, things that the country could do with it that wouldn't be considered development or couldn't be considered development.
Yeah, so there's definitely a problem if you take development assistance to be too broad. So for example, Joey, let me know if this is kind of what you're thinking. So it definitely would not be topical for the United States and the UK to like give $50 billion to like transport a bunch of snails to Madagascar with the argument that like if there were a bunch of snails that might like they would like put some slime on the ground, which would make the roads easier to drive on, which would therefore increase development infrastructure. Like that's not development assistance, even though it kind of might result in development, right?
I mean, I think there's an argument to be made there, but I don't know why you would.
Right, but I'm just trying, like, just let me know if I am not capturing the problem that you're trying to set out correctly. I thought one of the things you were saying was that you could pretty much say that anything is development assistance if your argument is that it results in development later.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? So the point is, like, there needs to be something else, like, i.e. the intention of a country, or, you know, to give the assistance, or something like that. In order to kind of constrain it, because otherwise the affirmative could just like say anything. Is development assistance. I wanted to get back to another point that you mentioned, Joey, which was so you mentioned that whether or not something is development assistance is maybe very directly related to whether or not a country in fact used it for development. This is actually a kind of very important question on this resolution, because one of the main arguments that we might talk about a little later is that governments will misuse funds given to them for the purpose of developing their country and like do other things with them. So a country in Africa, for example, and this happens very commonly, might take money earmarked for development and like use it to buy guns. So the question is, do we consider that development assistance? We still do, right? It was still done for the purpose of development, even though it might not have been used for development. Or do we not even count it as development assistance at all?
It depends on what side you're on.
Depends on what side you're on. That's fair. And so Lawrence, what do you think is the most sort of accurate reading of this question?
I don't know. I don't think it actually has to be used for development assistance.
For development.
Yeah, or for development, because I think it's like reasonable to argue that in fact development assistance gets used for nefarious purposes, and that would deny an obligation to provide it in the first place. And I think that's a reasonable argument to be made.
Yeah, I'm gonna agree with both of you all, which is that I firmly believe that I do believe that the best thing for development assistance is kind of like an intention thing, and I do think that the aid probably has to be conditioned to something. But I also think that if you're affirmative, I'm definitely not going to say that. You know?
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. And so now let's go from development assistance, kind of like the form that it takes, which is usually aid. Oh, sorry. Let's talk about loans. So most development assistance is a loan, right? Which is not exactly the same thing as aid. It's where you give people money, but you expect them to pay you back later. That's what it is, right? Lawrence.
Can you repeat that? Like, you said it was aid, not what?
So most forms of development assistance are loans, right? It's usually not a huge amount of, conditional aid. Normally it's loans.
Well, if it was, I was unaware of that. Because most places will say that the terms official development and assistance are interchangeable with terms like international aid, foreign aid, overseas aid, development assistance. And it seems like a lot of these people don't think that it is a loan. Because I think one of the prongs that people will list here is that funding must be sort of concessional in character.
What does that mean?
Where like it's not like it's well, I guess they are loans, are they not? Let's see.
But they're
like very very generous loans.
So
like very long grace periods.
Yes. So here's just a little bit of history. Most of the development assistance that's been conducted from the United States to other countries, as well as from a lot of other countries and international institutions. So there's some international institutions that you all should be aware of. This is just some vocabulary for some listeners. IMF stands for International Monetary Fund. International Monetary Fund. They do a lot of development assistance. Same thing, the World Bank is what it's called. I don't think it's not literally a bank, I believe. Or it is like kind of a bank. But mostly it just gives assistance to people, usually development assistance. And those two things together are called, I'll spell this out, but Bretton Woods, Bretton, and then the word Woods with a space between them. Bretton Woods institutions, I don't know why it's called that. Presumably, like that's what the IMF and the World Bank are called. There are a lot of United Nations programs themselves that provide development assistance. But the IMF and the World Bank are huge portions of development assistance. What they primarily do is they give conditional loans. They say, we will give you loans, you will have to pay us back. In exchange for giving you these loans, you have to do the following things for your economy. And they are usually like geared towards development. Usually they're geared towards like internationalization of things. I was about to say striking a bell. I guess is ringing a bell is kind of the same thing as striking a bell. But Lawrence, is this ringing a bell?
Yeah. Okay. So I was just totally wrong beforehand. In fact, development assistance is just a bunch of loans.
Yeah, I mean,
but they're very concessionary loans, like super low interest period, or like low interest rates, or really long grace periods to pay back.
Right. A lot of them are loans, and of course, the kind of overall thing that we're trying to say, Joey, obviously, is that the countries will eventually be able to pay back the loans with all the development we gave them. Right.
That would be the hope.
That would be the hope. Precise words. That are exactly right. Okay, so now let's finish up our topic of development assistance with what it is that you are developing. So the first one I have listed here is infrastructure. Lawrence, what is infrastructure? I know that we use the word a lot, but like, what does it mean?
Roads and bridges and other cool things that people need to like get around.
And yeah, and Joey, correct me if I'm wrong about this, but the whole idea of infrastructure is basically that like you have an economy, but if people can't like move to give each other things, then the economy stops working. Is that right?
Basically.
Yeah, basically.
Basically, yeah.
So infrastructure, you build roads and public places where people can go and exchange goods with each other or services. You know, if you couldn't really have an economy if no one could actually get out of their house, right? Like that just wouldn't exist. So, think of it as kind of like the ant farm tunnels of the economy. Like stuff needs to move around in order for an economy to work. If someone buys something from somebody else, like that's infrastructure. A lot of development assistance is for infrastructure, Lawrence, or am I wrong about that? I know that a decent chunk is. Would you say the majority is, or the majority isn't? I'm legitimately not sure.
Neither am I, and so I'm not gonna make a guess without quickly Googling this.
But a lot of it is, right, Joey? I mean, a lot of it's like giving money to places so that they'll have like roads that cars can drive on.
Yeah, it seems intuitively like it would be.
Yeah. I don't think any of us quite know offhand, but certainly a lot of it is infrastructure. Okay, so here's an interesting question: technology assistance. So, can you just give people a bunch of solar panels and that's development assistance? Lawrence, what do you think?
I don't see why not. I don't know why anyone would do that if there was no infrastructure to begin with, but I suppose you could. I don't see why it's not.
Well, I mean, okay, so
Because like you can give development aid to like improve electrical power. You can to like build grids. You can give development aid to like improve water resources. I don't understand why you couldn't like give them solar panels to help like shore up in a failing electrical grid or something like that.
so definitely you can give development assistance for energy development, right? And that kind of
Oh
includes
yeah.
electrical and solar stuff.
Yeah, I don't see why not. I'd be like a little bit more skeptical if that was like if your technology assistance was in the form of handing everyone an iPhone 7, but I don't know.
There were some people that actually made arguments about that on the democracy promotion topic. Like, we're like one of the ideas for democracy promotion, which is very similar topics, by the way. Which that was a couple years ago now. Was they would just like give all a bunch of Syrian rebels smartphones, and that would like Syrian dissidents in the Arab Spring, and that would like help them assist them with democracy. So as ridiculous as that is, like there's some people that say that. I mean, not necessarily for development assistance, but for democracy promotion, which kind of proves that if you really stretch it far enough, you can say that anything is development assistance. Okay, markets. So this is a big one. So Joey, what is your understanding of like market-based development assistance? Are you kind of like trying to improve the like New York Stock Exchange sort of thing? Like not literally the stock exchange, but are you trying to like help? Like what exactly are we doing to the markets? Do you know?
That's a really good question. I would imagine just like trying to allow the free market to flourish,
Yeah.
like give a little bit of assistance to give it a little bit of a push, and then the ultimate goal would be for the market to become, I guess, self-sustaining.
Yeah, that sounds a little more reasonable than what I was saying. I know there's a thing called foreign market development or FMD. Um, so you're trying to make the market work. Like if there's too many tariffs or something, no one can sell goods to each other, then an economy doesn't work and it can't develop.
Right.
Okay, so are any of you familiar with this thing? So I found a lot of stuff around FDI, which stands for foreign direct investment. So now I believe, Joey, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe FDI is like when a corporation or a nation gives like just a bunch of money, like invests, quote unquote, like in an industry. Like you buy portions of an industry. Or you just like put a bunch of money into it, maybe.
I haven't really heard that specific terminology, but that intuitively sounds right.
That is actually what it is.
Awesome.
Okay, sick. Because like I was wondering about FDI and I was wondering whether or not I had the like total wrong thing. Um, so okay, now last thing, and this will play into a discussion of FDI. Soon we'll get into the actual arguments, but development assistance is actually very complicated. So I wanted to make sure that you all listeners at home and we all wanted you to make sure that you had a great understanding of kind of like what it exists. Okay, two things. One, Lawrence, there's a lot of development assistance right now, right?
A good amount, in fact.
Yeah, pretty sure there's a ton of it.
Couple actually wait, what is the numbers here? It's like
it's got to be some absurd number, like hundreds of billions of dollars, probably.
Yeah, so like EU alone gave like 70 billion and like the US gives another 30 billion and each of those individual yep. So it's a lot.
And then Spain gave $50. Everyone's doing their part. Shout out to Spain. Hope you have an economy soon, guys. Heart. Okay, so development assistance. There is a lot of it now, and is the negative you think compelled to stop giving development assistance entirely, like to cut off current development assistance, or is it just that they can't do more of it? And is this just completely irrelevant?
Well, so I guess you could say no development assistance, or I guess you could just say you can give it, but there's no obligation to give it.
Yeah. Okay, so And the second thing that I wanted to talk about, Joey, let me know if this is true. What is your understanding of like charities versus governments giving development assistance? Like I know charities give a lot of it. So do you think our listeners should like be careful and try to like maybe avoid stuff that explicitly mentions charities, or do you think that like most of the literature about why charities should or shouldn't give development assistance will still be affirmative arguments anyway, so we shouldn't have to worry about that?
I think it really depends, because one distinction you want to draw is like specifically disaster relief isn't going to be the same thing as developmental assistance. So it kind of depends on what types of charities it is and what kind of assistance they're giving. If it's a charity that is giving development assistance, as long as that isn't your advocacy, it seems like the logic in terms of like moral obligations behind it would like still be sort of applicable.
Definitely. 100% agree. One last question before we get into actual arguments. This is related to charities. So the resolution says wealthy nations have an obligation to provide development assistance to other nations. So this means, Lawrence, correct me if I'm wrong, that the wealthy nations have to give the money directly to the country.
Yeah, so I don't think it's topical if charities give it, or even if wealthy nations like direct some charities to give it, although I have no idea how they would do that. Or but so I think it is actually that it has to be official state assistance to other nations.
Okay, so and maybe Joey, maybe you can help me with this. So does that mean that the United States, that it would not be resolutional for the United States to give money just like to some charity that did development work? Like let's say there was one who's like development organization for development in Africa or whatever. Like it would not be topical for the United States just to give them a bunch of money.
Yeah,
right?
I don't know why, like I don't know why the US would do that, or like why that argument would be strategic, but no, I would say that's not topical.
Well, I think that like some people might do things like say, oh, like look at these charity organizations that are doing great work, because there are a bunch of literature about like why NGOs are great. So NGO stands for non-governmental organizations. Okay, so I think we have a pretty good handle on the resolution and like what development assistance is. When we come back, we'll talk about affirmative arguments. In this section, we'll talk about affirmative arguments. What we're going to do is we're going to talk about 3 different affirmative arguments. We're going to talk about what they are, how to research them, and then what are some good arguments against these things. And for these, we've gotten to some of the more arcane ones that we haven't necessarily discussed on the podcast, a bunch of them before. So we're going to get into some new value criterion structures that you all can use through the debate. So this episode has relevance beyond just this topic. It'll have relevance to you even on future ones. All right. First affirmative case I have written here as the veil of ignorance argument. So this is an affirmative case that's premised around the philosopher John Rawls, who I believe wrote in the 70s. Is that right, Lawrence? He wrote in the 60s and 70s.
Shoot, that's a good question. Yeah, I think so. Theory of Justice was the 70s, right?
And by 60s and 70s, I mean 1960 and 1970. If I was like, hey, there's this Greek philosopher, he wrote in 60.
Okay, yeah. It was early 70s, so it was 1971.
1971. Okay, cool. So John Rawls, he's the main person that made this argument. So we're going to kind of go down this framework step by step. It's an independent framework. It's not utilitarianism. It is not deontology. It's neither of those things. It's its own separate thing, and it's kind of awesome. And I kind of really like it. I think it's great. So Joey, I think you're somewhat of an expert on this, on the veil of ignorance stuff. So
well, that's a little bit of a stretch, but I am quite familiar with the argument.
So let's kind of make this clearer by talking about Rawls's political project. So Rawls, in A Theory of Justice, is trying to organize kind of an ideal society. He's trying to say, what would the principles of justice be that govern society? Sort of like, how would it work? And he has something called the veil of ignorance that he tries to use to figure that out. So, Joey, what is the veil of ignorance, and how does it figure in with Rawls's ideal society, with theories, with ideas of justice?
So the basic idea is that when deciding what is and isn't just, you should put yourself behind this veil of ignorance where you imagine that you don't know what your position is in society. So you're basically deciding what is and isn't just based, or like what you would or wouldn't want to happen based on not knowing what your position is in society or who you are. And so it really makes you think about how the decision or idea would impact everyone, and really weighing those sort of different outcomes.
So I want to pick up on something very specific that you said that might have sounded like a minor point. So you said when you're selecting the ideas of justice. So I want to draw a kind of a sharp distinction that maybe will help you all when you're trying to understand what's the sort of thing that Rawls is trying to do. So what Rawls is not trying to do is he's not trying to say, like, let's try and figure out if you would like buy a sandwich under the veil of ignorance. What Rawls isn't trying to do is he's not trying to look at individual decisions and be like, do these decisions make sense under the veil of ignorance? Because a lot of them wouldn't. Because a lot of them would be like, person specific. Like, would it be to your advantage to lie? It's like, well, sometimes, not all the time. The veil of ignorance isn't really good at answering those questions. But what Rawls really thinks, and correct me if I'm wrong, Joey, but what Rawls really thinks is that when you're trying to figure out principles of justice and kind of like how society works in general, then the veil of ignorance is good for selecting those principles. Because can you talk about how kind of bias figures in Rawls? Rawls really does not like the idea of bias in our theory of justice. So how does the veil of ignorance help with bias, and why is bias a problem?
Yeah, so the idea is that when you're coming up with a theory of justice and right and wrong, it's easy to get caught up in what's going to benefit you, whereas behind the veil of ignorance, you don't know what's going to benefit you specifically since you don't know your position in society. So it sort of forces you to go outside your own biases and sort of think about different people in different positions and how it'll affect them.
Exactly. So you can't really be self-interested under the veil of ignorance. You can't just pick a theory of justice that just benefits you personally, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so Lawrence, I have a related question that I kind of want to ask you about the veil of ignorance. So the veil of ignorance sounds great as a tool that can help eliminate bias. When we're trying to figure out the conditions of justice that our society should be governed, those conditions that society should be governed under should be not influenced by bias. And the veil of ignorance, where we pretend that we can kind of get outside of our own personal situation and then talk about justice fully in the abstract, that is a good way of eliminating bias, according to Rawls. So we never actually go under the veil of ignorance, right? That's not an actual thing that people ever do, correct?
Yeah. No, there is no such thing as an actual veil of ignorance.
So then why do we care? Why is the veil of ignorance, which doesn't quote unquote exist, like what use is it to philosophers and to maybe governments? Why should we think about a veil of ignorance even if a veil of ignorance doesn't exist?
Well, because if our goal is to attempt to organize society such that it is a legitimate and fair system, the sort of closest we can get is if it sort of clears the deck of passing these sort of tests that we would create under the veil of ignorance.
Exactly right. So the idea is, just like the social contract, for those of you that listen to our episode on that, governments never actually created a social contract. That's not a thing that ever literally happened. But the idea was that because a social contract is kind of a fair deal, that it kind of makes sense that people would kind of agree to that, then the social contract is a good way of thinking about the relationship between governments and citizens. So in the same way, the veil of ignorance is a great way about thinking about justice and how you organize society, because you're thinking, let's make decisions that we would make if we were not biased. And if we would make a decision when we are not biased, then of course that's extremely relevant. Okay, so I kind of want to talk a little bit about gambling, because understanding gambling is very important to understanding Rawls's veil of ignorance. So we have the veil of ignorance. The veil of ignorance just exists. We use it to select the principles of justice for our society. But if we just have a veil of ignorance, we haven't done anything yet. We still need to actually select the principles of justice. So in order to do that, Rawls thinks that we would come to some very important conclusions about what the theory of justice is. And Lawrence, I wanted to try and distinguish the principles of justice. So Rawls does not think that under the veil of ignorance, we would select a purely utilitarian line of thinking. Think, for example, that under the veil of ignorance, people would just choose to always produce the maximum social happiness and minimize the maximum social pain. Rawls does not think that we would choose that. And I'm curious if you know why that is. Why is it that people would not, under the veil of ignorance, people would not decide bias-free to consent to that system?
So there's a few reasons why. I think the one that he is most prominently harping on is this argument that there's a difference in sort of distribution across people, and that utilitarianism would say, well, at least purely aggregative versions of utilitarianism would say, as long as we maximize total overall happiness, that's fine. But people at sort of the bottom of the chain probably wouldn't really like that, because they would always be the ones that don't get access to sort of any of this good stuff. And so they would prefer a system which is more about equitable distribution of utility, not about total maximization of utility.
That's definitely true, and I think it's really important to understand exactly why that is. So I'm gonna try and talk with this about Joie with Joie for a second. So Rawls's general idea, as Lawrence pointed out, is that people under the veil of ignorance would not choose to maximize utility if it meant an unequitable or inequitable distribution across people. What Rawls is doing here is he's making an argument about human nature. So what exactly is Rawls saying about human nature here? Like, why does he think that people would not be utilitarians under the veil of ignorance?
He seems to basically be saying that we wouldn't want to risk being in the worst possible position in a utilitarian scenario on the off chance that we end up in a better position, versus we would be more willing to, I guess it's kind of like a risk reward type of thing. We don't want to risk something really bad happening to us for a chance of a reward. Rather, we would prefer to have a guarantee that we'll be in a decent position.
That's a perfect explanation of why Rawls thinks that way. So Rawls is exactly right. That's exactly how Rawls thinks about it, and it's really important that our listeners understand what you said, Joey. So it is exactly a risk-reward sort of thing. And if you could just summarize your point in one sentence, what does Rawls think about humans and their wanting to take risks? How does he think humans are generally about taking risks? Does he think we want to take risks, or do we not?
No, we do not.
Yes. Humans, according to Rawls, and Rawls is an economist, Rawls thinks humans are risk averse. He thinks that under the veil of ignorance, people would not gamble with extremely high stakes. They would want a world where they do not get screwed over. So here's a kind of a situation. So under the Rawlsian veil of ignorance, so Lawrence, a utilitarian would think that if there was a society where 70% of the people lived in pretty good luxury, like kind of like medium level luxury, and 30% of the people lived in terrible slavery. A lot of utilitarians would accept that as a desirable outcome, right?
Well, there would have to be those people who are happy would have to be really, 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 really happy for that for that math to play out. But yeah,
well, not even really happy, just like 2 times less happy, because there are like a bunch more of them, right? So the idea is that like a utilitarian could do a math problem and is like, well, things are like twice as worse for the people in the 30%, but there are like more than 2 times more of the people in the 70%. So like that societal distribution would still be better for utilitarianism for those people, right?
for some, I mean, because it's not a comparison of like that state to like in a vacuum, but like relative to other potential societal arrangements that could reasonably exist that would maximize utility. But sure, in the abstract, yes, you could, and you could easily justify slavery through a utilitarian perspective.
Right. I mean, like it's not a given, but the point is like under the veil of ignorance, if you just presented just like those facts dispassionately, like a utilitarian might like crunch the numbers and be like, yeah. And the point is that even if the numbers worked out in utilitarianism in the favor of utilitarianism, Joey, what I think you're saying is that people under the Rawlsian veil of ignorance would not choose that scenario.
Yeah, exactly.
That would not be a good deal, that they would be like, I don't want to be in slavery. That's like the worst possible thing. I wouldn't gamble with my life getting slightly better from the baseline if like I roll the dice and I end up in slavery. That's awful. So,
Right.
Okay, that's the veil of ignorance, and you would justify that in any of your debate rounds. This is an extremely useful philosophy. Now, the principle that it warrants, which we kind of just got to, so the principle is helping the least well off, right? I'm pretty sure I remember that as being right. So least well off in society, right? Right, Lawrence?
Yeah, so the least well off in society.
Okay, so, but I kind of want to expand it from just society here. So let's get in. That was the framework. Now let's get into the contentions. The contention sort of arguments. How exactly does this affirm? Now, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Joey, but I believe that what a lot of the affirmative authors on this topic are arguing in terms of the veil of ignorance is that we should not stop at the borders of society to figure out who the least well off are. It shouldn't just be the least well off in society. It should be the least well off in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's absolutely right.
So can you talk about the lottery of birth? I have lottery of birth down in the notes. Could you talk about exactly what that is and how that plays into what we just mentioned?
Yeah, I'd say that's kind of like what we were just talking about. There isn't really, I mean, it's just kind of random what your circumstances are, and so we shouldn't value certain people over others or their needs over others.
Right. So those people, these people think that being born in a developed country is chance, and therefore should not affect your welfare, right?
Yes.
They think that like, so that is an unfair, quote unquote, advantage that you gain just by living somewhere else. And Rawls basically thinks across nations, those things should not exist. There should not be those kinds of disparities, because that's kind of, in a way, punishing you for something out of your control. Yeah. So there's a bit of terminology, Lawrence, that maybe you could explain to us, and it's kind of just this idea in a nutshell. Can you talk about cosmopolitanism real quick? Like, what is that phrase, cosmopolitan?
So it's a general phrase used to refer to a collective group of philosophical theories that argues that sort of borders are irrelevant, and it's based off of this idea that humans all have this fundamental innate equality that means that they are all worth the same no matter where you are born, and so that thus you should have an obligation to sort of treat other people in different places basically the same as you would treat someone that lived in your own country.
And now we get to the meat of it. So let's talk about how it affirms. As far as I understand it, there are 2 arguments why this case affirms. Number one is that the resolution just asks if nations, wealthy nations have an obligation to those other nations to help them develop. And I believe Joie Rawls would say just like, yes, we have an obligation to those countries.
Yeah.
That our obligations should not stop at borders.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, so Rawls thinks that there is sort of some relevance to the border, but Rawls does think that there is some basic duty or obligation to assist other countries. More specifically, the line is that all societies are to be assisted to the conditions that make a well-ordered society possible. This implies that human rights are to be secured everywhere and that basic human needs are to be met. Wealthier societies have duties and obligations to societies burdened by such conditions.
Cool. And it says wealthy in it. Ooh, that's nice.
Wealthier societies have,
Yeah. Good enough. Okay, and then the second one is Rawls's veil of ignorance generates a principle to help mitigate income inequality. So, obviously, then, if development assistance actually did that would be a point in its favor, right, Joey?
Yes.
Yeah. So, it's important to note that these different contention arguments have different kind of conditions associated with them. In order to win the one that we have obligations to other countries, just very generally, you do not necessarily need to win that development assistance actually makes things better in those countries, because you've proven that we have an obligation to those countries. And then for the second contention, you would need to win that you actually decrease income inequality in a country by providing development assistance. And it's important to realize when you're affirmative and when you're negative that those two things are different. Okay, so that was quite a large amount of time, but I think we really went deep on the veil of ignorance, and you all can use that on your future topics. So next section, how do you research this case? Lawrence, do you want to talk about this section? We have a bunch of authors and kind of works. The first two things we have are some works of Rawls, and then we have some some other authors. Would you like to just talk about generally how you would research it and how you would look at these things?
Yeah, so the first two are books written by Rawls. The first is A Theory of Justice, which lays out most of the stuff we talked at the beginning of this section, sort of about how the veil of ignorance works and justice as fairness and the principles of justice, the core parts of his theory. The second one is The Law of Peoples, which is what I quoted from just now, and that's sort of discussing not just how we order societies within themselves, but how societies have to interact with one another. And it talks about international relations between different societies. So the two other people that are listed here, one's Peter Singer. He's a well-known utilitarian, well-known for the principle of beneficence, which just argues that if you can give up something at no significant moral cost to yourself, you ought to give that up to sort of improve the lives of other people. And Singer's arguments can easily be applied to societies who have obligations to less well-off societies. And finally, there's Martha Nussbaum, who is also a well-known, she's a cosmopolitan, right?
Yep.
Okay, just a well-known cosmopolitan author who makes arguments, I think, based around sort of human rights and why universal human rights are good and why we have to assist other people in bringing those about. That's right?
Yeah. This case is a lot of philosophy, guys. If you love philosophy, those are some really great works. I will say that I'm pretty, in my personal opinion, Law of the Peoples is really not Rawls's best work. A Theory of Justice really is, although it is a long book, is kind of great. But there are journal articles that are kind of based on it. And reading other people talk about Rawls is also very cool. And the Cosmopolitans are all just really lovely writers. Like Peter Singer and Nussbaum are just really good writers, especially Singer. Singer is super relevant on this topic. He's great. Okay, let's talk about two objections to this case. So Lawrence, when I talked to you about this last, I asked you, hey, why does the veil of ignorance matter if we can never actually go under the veil of ignorance? Now I have that listed here kind of as an objection to the veil of ignorance. Can you kind of walk us through that?
Yeah, so there are sort of, against Rawls's theory, I guess the two most common strands of objections are first that it's sort of an unusable standard. because we can't really use it. It's not a very good thought experiment or a metric by which we evaluate the justness of a society. If we could really never truly shed all of our built-in biases, how can we sort of use a thought experiment that asks you to abstract away from things that sort of have shaped the world in which you live and frames a lot of your experience and understanding? So it's like, for example, very difficult for rich people to sort of imagine a society that is structured for poor people. And there's just no person that's objective enough to sort of like actually go beyond the veil of ignorance and make a real determination. And at that point, that just sort of seems to lead to a lot of moral disagreement that can't be resolved because this metric we're trying to use to resolve it in the first place is flawed.
Yeah, Joey, can you just like talk to us a little bit about how kind of weird the veil of ignorance is to use? I mean, it's not like it can ever actually happen. There's also kind of a way in which Rawls's veil of ignorance is not just impossible, but like impossible in a very unhelpful way. Is there a way that is there a flaw you can see in the veil of ignorance from that perspective?
Yeah, I mean, basically the whole idea of the thought experiment is to give us an objective perspective that separates us from our own biases. But insofar as it's impossible for us to actually be separated from our own biases, there isn't, like, it's not really useful to just say, separate yourself from your biases and imagine that you could be in any possible position, because that doesn't actually give us any sort of metric. It just forces us into a position, or forces us to try to get into a position or a mindset that we can never actually get into.
Exactly. And one thing that is sort of aligned with that is like, I think that the kind of person that Rawls is imagining here is not possible. Like they're just even if you thought about the sort of end of the veil of ignorance, someone that just does not have any biases but can still think about things, and are somehow also risk averse, like the idea of that thing as existing is very economics. It's very economics to make those kind of assumptions, but it's also like not really a thing, right? I mean, it's just like there's no such thing as a bias-free person. We all have our biases. It depends on which ones.
Yeah, it seems like to even say that a person behind the veil of ignorance would be risk averse is to like give them some sort of bias, because it seems like some people are risk averse and some people aren't, or some people are more inclined to be risk averse and some people aren't. And so to say that a person behind the veil of ignorance would be risk averse is to still, project some sort of bias onto them.
That's a very good point. Even more of a sort of a straightforward objection to this, and we'll talk about another one in a second, but more on the lines of like objections to the process of the veil of ignorance itself. There are just economists that think that people aren't risk averse, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there are definitely people that are just like, Rawls is wrong. Like, people love to gamble.
Exactly.
So maybe he is a sort of utilitarian after all. And obviously, there's kind of an economics debate about that. And then Rawls would be like, my argument is human nature. And you can't capture human nature by just having experiments. And then it's like, then how do you know it's human nature, right? It can get really weird. Okay, and then the second main objection to the Rawls veil of ignorance affirmative case is I have written as factual turns. It hurts the least well off. Lawrence, what do you think I meant when I typed this a week ago?
Yeah, so if the goal is to help the least well off and development assistance ends up actually hurting the least well off for a variety of reasons, which we'll discuss in the negative section, then it seems like under the veil of ignorance, you would say, well, there's no obligation to provide development assistance.
Yeah, I mean, certainly we should not try and provide development assistance if it makes the least well off worse, right?
You would think so. It'd be a weird moral theory that does say that you ought to do that.
Important to note, though, that even if that were true, even if those arguments did turn the affirmative case is not utilitarian, even then. It is consequentialist. Do you remember, obviously, Lawrence, you know the difference between those. Can you just tell the listeners what the main difference between consequentialism and utilitarianism is?
So utilitarianism is a subset of consequentialism, which argues that sort of like happiness is the sort of moral good, and consequentialism doesn't really say that it has to be happiness that's what's important, but rather that the moral goodness of an action is predicated on the outcomes. And so Rawls is not a utilitarian because he has a lot of arguments that says that the distribution that occurs in a utilitarian system will hurt the least well off, and that that's a bad system. But Rawls is not so like deontological that he ignores consequences, and in fact does care about how things are arranged in society, and does care about the consequences of an action, specifically how they affect the least well off.
Exactly. All right, long time on that argument. This next one will be a little easier. Let's talk about structural violence. This is the next affirmative position. So before we get into this, I want to mention that a lot of the points that we're going to make here for structural violence could be made under a utilitarian criterion. But what we've decided to do is we've decided to talk about structural violence because it's really picking up in debate now and is kind of a really smart way to argue. So Lawrence, you just distinguish between utilitarianism and consequentialism. Structural violence is a form of consequentialism, right?
Yeah.
And what consequence do you care about?
Well, not that I really think that structural violence is necessarily an actual ethical framework, but I guess it's a form of consequentialism that prioritizes violence that is high probability and systemic and results from structures that tend to affect the least well off. And so structural violence, I get the sort of most easy to understand example would be like poverty. And those are sort of systems and structures in place that create poverty, which is a form of violence that is systemic and widespread, high probability, and tends to affect the least worst off.
The least well off.
Least well off. I'm sorry.
The least worst off,
silly.
aka corporations.
Yeah.
Okay.
Poverty really hurts them. If there's so much poverty, how can anyone buy their stuff?
That's true. So structural violence. So Joey, when I say that violence is structural, and this is relating to all the stuff that Lawrence has said. When I say that violence is structural, like what am I kind of like contrasting with? Like what kind of violence isn't structural?
What kind of violence isn't structural?
Right, and so that we know which one is structural. Like what's structural versus non-structural violence?
Well, non-structural violence would be on more of an individual level, like one person being violent towards another person, whereas structural violence is more going to be like actual social institutions that are like causing harm to a certain group of people.
Exactly, right? So like an individual act of violence is not structural. So if I went over to Lawrence and I stole his 7th computer, right?
Okay,
like that would be
Look here. I'm feeling called out here. So for those of you who don't know, I purchased, or because we talked about this during the break, I bought a new computer, but it's not my 7th one. I'm just replacing one that I'm selling.
It's just your 3rd, right?
The 3rd that I own, yes. And then I'm getting rid of one of them, so I'll be back down to 2.
Why would you get rid of computers? Anyway, so if I took Lawrence's 12th computer away from him, such that he no longer had 12 computers, it was very sad. Individual act of violence, right?
Yeah, that is an individual act of violence, but this sort of bullying over my computers is structural violence.
What? No, it's not structural violence, but that's our point, right? The violence doesn't come from the structure; it comes from me being mean to you.
You're a structure.
I am a structure. That's true. I'm so structured. But Joey, structural violence, as you said, comes from kind of like institutions and kind of like the way things work. And
Exactly.
So the whole idea is that like for structural violence, right? Like no one person is the cause of a structural violence, right?
Yeah.
And that can make it difficult to track down. Poverty is the classic example of structural violence. It's hard to say like, oh, this is the person that's doing the poverty to the people, right? Like that sentence just doesn't even make sense. But violence is still happening to people. It's horrible violence, and it's happening to people, but it is kind of slow, right, Joey? Like it's difficult to see sometimes. It's slow.
Yeah, that's one way to put it.
Yeah, exactly. So so violence is slow. Poverty income inequality. One way of thinking about structural violence is like, it's kind of the everyday violence. It's the violence that never happens all at once. It kind of happens very slowly. And again, you could make a utilitarian argument for the importance of addressing structural violence. And that's kind of, in a sense, what you're doing. But what you're doing is you're using consequentialism as a way of sort of getting around some of those fuzzy questions. But what you're saying is poverty, just the way that things are. Like, violence comes from the way that things are sometimes. The institutions that generate them, institutions meaning like, an organization or a set of organizations, or just like the idea of structural violence is that the way things currently exist can be violent. The conditions that you find yourself in day to day, those can be a form of violence too, even though it's kind of a weird violence to think about. So,
Right.
So lack of food, poverty, income inequality, etc. So now let's bring this to the topic. I think we all can kind of see where it's going. Joey, can you talk about how the structural violence argument makes sense on this resolution? Like, how would an affirmative deploy a framework of structural violence on this topic?
Well, basically, because the institutions that are in place or the way things work right now are obviously not working for these countries that aren't wealthy or these developing countries. And so we would be sort of reducing structural violence by changing these social institutions or structures in a way that will benefit developing countries.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very straightforward thing, right? I mean,
Yeah.
this is like what all of the actual literature on the topic is talking about, right? Like whether or not development assistance actually like makes things better.
Exactly.
And the whole idea is like the thing that you're making better are the structural conditions that make things bad for people every day, rather than like, a specific warlord gunning down villagers. It's more like, although that obviously is a problem, but it's more like in the majority of countries, the problem is just that like they just don't have roads, so they can't really have an economy that is good, and then as a consequence, its people are miserable. And
Yeah.
that's a very like broad generalization of a whole bunch of different countries, but that is kind of the picture, Lawrence, that this argument is painting, right? It's painting like these other countries, things are really bad for them. There's a lot of structural violence, and development assistance can help mitigate some of that.
Yep, precisely. That's it. The more interesting literature is not really over like what is structural violence, but like, does development assistance work at alleviating structural violence? Did I say that right? Does development assistance work at alleviating structural violence?
Yeah.
And just discussing the various areas in which you could attempt to improve any given developing nation that receives development assistance.
Yes, exactly. So I think researching this one will be kind of even easier than the other one. So how do you research this topic? In a very general sense, Lawrence.
So I noticed here that you have this like bulk Google Scholar articles on the effectiveness of this. Didn't we do an episode on research and like tips and tricks about Google Scholar recently, right?
Yeah, but I just meant like, so on Google Scholar on this resolution is where you're going to find a ton of studies, right? Like you're just going to find so many studies being like, we ran the numbers, development assistance either works or it doesn't work. And I'm saying like, this is the affirmative case where you would use that stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
The only reason I mentioned Google Scholar was just like I've been on Google Scholar a lot recently, and like there's so many like economics articles and journals written in the United States, but also internationally about things.
Maybe I should do some of that research.
Dude, I found so many. Let me check. There was this one country that I just found like a ton of random articles about. It was all the same country on some of the same, like, dude, Norway. Joey, how crazy is that? There's so many articles from Norway. How does that?
That's weird.
That's kind of awesome. Yeah, their names are great.
Wait, what are people from Norwegian? Is that okay? Yeah.
It was the Norwegian something. Okay, so you research it. You look up stuff about poverty. You look up stuff on the effectiveness of economic growth. You just look up just stuff that's like economic assistance, development assistance. Like, it works. That's good. Okay, now let's talk about 2 arguments against this affirmative. Joey, do you have one?
Well, I think the basic one would just be that giving countries developmental assistance, especially there's a lot of literature about like just giving countries money is not helpful and doesn't work or can make things worse and that kind of thing. And that's going to be like a really common turn that you can make for pretty much any sort of framework. So yeah, I think that is definitely a strong response.
Yeah, so when you try to do development assistance, it just like it doesn't work, right? The other side of the Google Scholar articles.
Right.
And it's like there will be affirmative articles that are like Google Scholar definitely works, and then there will be other Google Scholar articles that are like those people are bananas. Like it doesn't work at all. And there are tons of examples of development assistance not working. There's a lot of it.
Right.
And the idea is that it makes things worse. When I'm researching this topic, I might look for something like, and we'll talk about this later, we'll talk about, development assistance, like unintended consequences, assistance backfires, or one economics word that might be useful is the word externalities. And an externality is basically when you do something to someone and it has negative effects for someone else. Like if the United States gives money to developing nations, governments, that might have negative effects on their civilians in kind of random, unforeseen ways. And basically that's this argument. The argument is like, well, development assistance has good intentions, but really the studies do not back up what the affirmative is saying. And the second argument I have here is that structural violence is less important than physical violence. So there's a bunch of negative arguments on this topic, Lawrence, about conflict, about how development assistance can maybe help increase things like conflict in the nations that it is targeting. So one obvious kind of argument there is that like the actual conflict that might happen as a result of development assistance, that is a form of, you could say, quote unquote, real violence. And that outweighs structural violence. Outweighs in the sense of like, it is more important to talk about these issues of violence than it is to talk about structural violence. Does this argument kind of make sense? What is your understanding of this argument?
Yeah, that's like totally fine. I don't know how much literature there is to support it, but sure.
There's definitely a bunch of literature on the conflict stuff. And then you might have to get into a debate with your opponent about structural violence and whether that's more or less important than non-structural violence, etc. All right, anything to add, you all, or should we go on to the next one? Oh, okay.
Yeah, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I just wanted to add that I think it's a good idea to frame it as structural violence specifically instead of util, even though, like we said, a lot of the arguments are like pretty util type arguments, if for no other reason than that those are kind of like buzzwords in the community right now.
That's so right.
Yeah, and people are going to hear that and like sort of think of it differently or take it more seriously than just like a basic util framework.
Yeah, I mean, structural violence is really the new hotness right now, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Lawrence, have you ever used the phrase "new hotness" in real life?
Sorry, what was the question?
Have you ever used the phrase "the real hotness" in real life?
That isn't even what you originally said.
The new hotness. Yeah.
Maybe
No.
you should start.
I thought that.
I'd rather not.
Don't be the new coldness.
Oh man, that's good. We should make that a thing.
Ooh, can we also not? that might be better. That might be better.
I'm quitting the podcast now. This is too much. This is the last straw.
We've lost
Okay,
Lawrence.
bye.
Lawrence has run out of straws. People, please send pictures of straws to the Argument Clinic podcast at gmail.com. Lawrence needs some more straws so that he'll continue to work with me on the podcast. Okay. Next affirmative case. I have this listed as international law. So, quick start. Just want to briefly talk about what is international law. So international law is kind of really wonky because it's not like the Constitution and the statutes in the United States, where there's a very rigid designation about which laws come, and everyone kind of agrees on the basic procedures that the laws work in the United States. Even people disagree on the specific applications. International law is a lot more contested, right, Lawrence? Like, there are definitely people that are like, international law does not apply to me. And it's kind of hard to say in the absence of an explicit agreement that people do care about international law. It's sort of a little more difficult to nail down, right?
Yeah, definitely very contestable, very controversial.
Yeah, but so international law in terms of like, what is it? It is the United Nations is what everyone thinks of when they think of international law. There are courts associated with, like, sort of with the United Nations, but they're also kind of separate, and it's difficult to say. That's called the International Criminal Court. You all don't have to know this stuff, but the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, and it's a little weird though, because the International Criminal Court would be like, hey, you are guilty of crimes. Come, we will lock you up. And then the country is like, no. And then International Criminal Court is like, rats. Like the International Criminal Court does not have an army or anything. But it is, broadly, the mandates of things like the International Criminal Court, the United Nations, and the rules that it sets out, as well as treaties that countries make, either through the United Nations or with each other. So if the United States signs a treaty with Canada, that is international law. I mean, it's a binding treaty, but it is international in legally binding. So that's kind of what international law is. And this case, Joey, can you just tell me what this case is basically saying? Like, of course, international law exists, but what is the argument in favor of development assistance from international law?
Well, first of all, I would define the word obligation as a legal obligation, just like within the framework, because there are a lot of, like, if you look up the definition of obligation, there, like, you can find a definition that says it's a legal obligation, and then you would just say that in terms of legal obligations that countries are under, you kind of have to look to international law because, that just makes sense. And then you would just find stuff under international law, like that the UN says, that says countries should probably do this.
That's exactly right. Lawrence, I want to talk to you about the framework of this case. So Joey has kind of set up what the framework says, sort of in a very general sense, and what the contention says in a general sense. Let's try and get a little deeper. What is the framework for this case? Why should we follow international law? So Joey mentioned the first reason, which is that you can define obligation to be legal obligation, and then of course, international law is sort of obviously one of those. But what are some other reasons why we might want to follow international law on a philosophical level?
Yeah, so the first one is just sort of establishing some sort of moral obligation to follow the law. Like if you sort of are party to a treaty or like agree to follow some sort of international law, then you probably have an obligation to follow that. There are also some more...
I'm sorry to cut you off, but I think this is a very important point, and that is like the main argument that we're going to be making. So where does the obligation come from? If you sign a treaty, why are you then obligated to fulfill the terms of the treaty?
It's a good question. I don't, for instance, personally really believe that there is anything more than a prima facie reason to follow the obligation to follow the law. But
you want to define that for us?
Oh, prima facie, like on face. Like, I think that the obligation to follow the law exists unless there is some sort of overriding moral consideration that matters. So, for example, if the law is unjust because it, for example, says that you have to like murder like the second person you see every Sunday, like I would not follow that. But I guess you could argue that sort of states in particular do have some obligation to follow laws that they are party to for some reasons, such as like consent, some reasons such as like international harmony, for other reasons such as like that's sort of the only like way to make the law hold any power or strength whatsoever.
All of those are legitimate reasons that people think. Now, Lawrence, the one that I've heard most and the one that I've kind of used the most is kind of a Kantian one about promises. So, what is your understanding of? So, does Kant think you can? And so, Kant, one of the key deontologists, he's pretty clear about why you can't break your promises, right?
Yeah, because if you did so, it would violate every formulation of the categorical imperative.
Yeah, so overall, Kant does not think that it makes sense to break promises. And I think that a lot of the time, what people basically use for the international law argument is they say that it would kind of be breaking a promise if we agreed to this international treaty and then decided not to do it. That it's like we promise to do the thing, and then if we don't do the thing, that's kind of immoral. So the way that I recommend that you all do this at home is you don't necessarily have to justify the whole categorical imperative, but you just say, morally, it is bad to break promises. And therefore, we should follow international law because international law really is just a set of promises that states have made with each other. Does that make sense, Lawrence?
Yeah, it makes some sense to me, even though I still don't fully agree with it. But as a debate argument, it makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of disagreements possible with that argument. Another thing that you mentioned, Lawrence, about international harmony. So
yeah, so
that
there's
is, another good argument for it, right?
Yeah, so there seems to be some people that think that, like, for the purposes of promoting the best outcome in a sort of consequentialist sense, that states sort of need to adhere to a system of rules and agreements that make possible, like, cooperation and harmony in an international realm, and that if you just refuse to abide by conventions that we've all adopted through treaties and laws, that sort of makes, like, the entire international arena like a sort of Hobbesian state of war, and we all just fight each other and stuff. That's bad.
Hobbesian, like Hobbes,
Yeah.
right? Okay. So yeah, I mean, having an international system is key to sort of having rules and stuff by which countries can follow and live better and stuff like that, right?
Yeah, basically.
And that in general, if we all didn't follow laws, things would be way worse for all of us.
Yep. And I mean, that's sort of part of the reason for why there might be an obligation to follow the law in the first place, because the law is useful only because sort of everyone adheres to it, and that creates, cooperation, peace, harmony, etc.
Right. And that is the argument, like that is a social contract argument that people say, right? They say that people have an obligation to obey their end of the social contract, and what they normally mean by that is that they have the citizens at least have the obligation to obey laws because they gave up those rights.
Yep.
So the international law sort of centers around that. So now that we've got the framework out of the way, so a quick summary of the arguments that we made. You can make arguments about the importance of keeping your promises. You can make arguments about the definition of obligation and it being a legal obligation. You can make arguments about kind of like international harmony and how the world would be better if everyone followed international law. And then you can make arguments kind of about the way that the international system resembles the government in much the way that the social contract does. Okay, now I'm going to turn over to Joie here and talk about why the international law argument affirms the resolution. So number one is that the United Nations has this, I think it's Declaration of Human Rights, right? I know it's the UNDHR, but it's like the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. I think it's Declaration. Is it Declaration? Am I crazy?
That sounds right.
United. I'm gonna Google this for a sec. United Nations Declaration. Yeah. Okay, it is Declaration of Human Rights. It just sounded weird there for a sec. So that has a lot of stuff in it, right? I mean, some of that's got to affirm.
Yeah, exactly. Some of it probably negates too.
Some of it probably negates. Whenever you're setting up an international law argument on any topic, and again, you could set up the framework that we talked about on any topic, you can really get pretty deep into a bunch of stuff, and the UNDHR almost certainly has some stuff that applies to you. However, most of it will come from treaties, right, Joey? Most of the actual obligations on this topic.
I'd say so.
Yeah, so like, what are some treaties that maybe like the resolution is about? I can't quite remember them. I know that there are a few, but I can't remember exactly what they are.
Yeah, I don't really remember any specific ones either.
So I know there's this thing called the ICCPR. What is that? International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Maybe there's some stuff about development. Lawrence, can you help me out here? What are all those like random treaties?
I have no clue. I don't think it's super relevant. I mean, it's not that hard to find some stuff about international law and like assisting poor countries.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you type treaties, development, international law, which I'm Googling right now, like this is God.
Yeah, because there's like duty to assist, things like that. There's like development law. There's some legal obligations to like assist in like infrastructure, things like that.
That's true. And definitely like countries might have agreed to help other countries do it in the past. Quick note, I typed treaties, development, international law. Do not do that because I just came up with a bunch of stuff. People are like, let's talk about the development of international law, which is not what we want. So probably have to mess around with the words there. We've already gotten into how you research it. You look up the UNDHR, you look up stuff about philosophy, about following international law, and you look up treaties that the United States and other countries might have signed on to. Specifically, maybe the United Nations, as a bunch of countries have signed a treaty that says that they have to go and help other people. Okay, let's talk about two arguments against international law before we move on to negative stuff. So, number one, law stinks. We shouldn't follow it. Joey.
Yeah, basically exactly what you said. Just like look up reasons why international law isn't that great, and you could also talk about how sort of what Lawrence was saying earlier, how other moral obligations might outweigh international law and just that kind of thing.
Yeah, definitely. Like it would be good to have some evidence for this, but you probably don't need evidence for it, right? Like, I mean, maybe we can think of just some general things that international law have done that are like pretty shady. Like it authorized the Middle Passage, right? I mean, that was an international law thing, sort of. I mean, there was no UN, but like.
Yeah, I guess the general idea is just that, like, just because something became an international law doesn't necessarily mean that it's morally good, and
Yeah, I mean, we shouldn't follow every, like, this is just generally an argument against following laws, right? Like, whenever anyone mentions the Constitution, and we've talked about this argument on the podcast many times before, but it's like, you shouldn't just follow things in the Constitution just because they're in the Constitution, because that might leave you with the Dred Scott decision.
Exactly.
Okay, so then the second one, and you mentioned this, Joey, so we'll come back to you. So there's probably sections of the UNDHR that say that nations don't have to do it, right? I mean, probably what they really say is that nations, maybe it would be good if they did, but not that they have an obligation necessarily to do it. Or maybe I'm just reading this wrong, and maybe what we're arguing is that there are other things that international law tells us to do, like generate good societies, and maybe development assistance makes things worse in terms of that.
Yeah, either one of those could be the case. You can pretty much find anything in international law if you look at it the right way. And I think the second thing you said, if you find something in international law about how like we should make good things happen in nations, and then you can just find something that says that pretty much the same turn we've already talked about, that developmental assistance doesn't actually help poor nations, then you're like, see, this is actually bad.
Yep, exactly. All right, so we've talked about some affirmative arguments. Now let's move on to some negative arguments. Three negative arguments. First is what I have listed as the realism NC. So this argument is an argument against the obligation of a nation to give development assistance to another nation, of course. And what I have written here, Joey, is we only care about citizens. So what is this argument, and how does it negate the resolution?
Basically, in real life, we only care about the citizens of our own country. Citizens of our own country have enough problems that we need to solve before we can even think about worrying about other people, and that's just the way it is. And if that is the case, we have no reason to be taking away money from, or wealthy nations in general really have no reason to be taking away money from their own citizens and giving it to people outside of the country.
That's a great synopsis, and I want to talk about two related contention arguments that you mentioned. You mentioned both of them. So there's the first one, which is that. So the overall argument, the framework argument, you obviously nailed, which is that we have our obligations to citizens. Nations only care about the obligations to their own citizens. So the number one sort of most basic thing is that means that nations do not have obligations directly to non-citizens, right?
Yeah.
So that kind of just means that the resolution, which seems to say the United Nations, that wealthy nations have obligations to the other nations, this kind of just looks at that resolution and is like, nope, there's no obligation at all.
Right.
Obligations do not work that way. And then the second thing you mentioned was about related to trade-offs. And what you basically said was any dollar we give to a developing nation is money that could help the citizens of a developed nation. So in a way, it kind of makes them worse.
So to some extent.
So it's we don't care about the welfare of other nations, so we should negate the resolution. But then also, if we do care about our own welfare, we should also negate the resolution, because it both harms our welfare directly.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. So definitely true. Let's talk about the framework for this argument a little bit. So Lawrence, this framework really relies a lot on kind of the social contract to generate a lot of its framework arguments, right?
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't have to be social contract, but it seems like the easiest way by which we can sort of base realism in. So
I've been kind of avoiding using that word, although I did start out immediately by saying it, so not very well. So Lawrence, what is realism? In the sense of international relations, there are a million kinds of realism. There's photorealism, and there's everyone calls themselves realism. But what is international relations realism?
So it's based in what I would call real politics statesmanship or whatever. It's basically that politics is always characterized by conflict between multiple actors pursuing power, or maybe if not even conflict, but I guess maybe competition might be a better word. And so it's sort of based in Hobbes, which we talked about in our social contract episode. And the idea is that sort of the international system is anarchic because there is no one single authority that can resolve disputes between different states and different governments, and that they will inevitably sort of fight with each other. And so really the only justifiable basis of the existence of the state is to preserve themselves and to protect their own citizens against every other state that wants to preserve itself and protect its own citizens.
So you said no central authority to govern stuff. What do international realist people think about international law?
I have no idea. I've always been interested in this. So
I'll give you a hint. It's not good.
I think most of them, because I think it does pose like a very significant criticism of realism. But I would guess that most realists would just be like, look, the like international law is just like silly. It doesn't really do anything. If it has any basis, it's all realist based anyways. It's most likely to fail, create conflict, things like that.
Yeah,
But
most of them really do not like international law.
But at the same time, though, like international law does seem to be like pose a severe problem for the existence of realists, because international law is governed by like the UN, which at least somewhat undermines the theory of realism. But oh well.
Well, yeah. So what Lawrence has done, listeners, is he's highlighted a very real disagreement between realists and other people. Realists basically think that the international system of anarchy exists, and that attempts to kind of like dress it up in international law are awful, and kind of like don't not only are like inaccurate, but hurt people.
Yeah, so like you would only agree to certain laws that would benefit you, but most laws don't end up benefiting everyone. So these are just basically tenuous, like breakable obligations that immediately get broken as soon as a state's interest is more important than the law itself. So like pretty much the law's just useless.
Yeah, and not only useless is that it compels states to make themselves worse for the benefit of others, for no real benefit to themselves. Now, of course, you could say some nations do benefit from international law, which is kind of true, and it gets into a really complicated debate. But for the purposes of our case, what I mean by the realism NC is you're saying that. So what realists think is that anything that you try and like, there's no such thing as a selfless international system action. That in fact, selflessness in the international system is damaging. It should be disallowed. So if you think of the resolution as kind of an attempt at selflessness, so you think that the resolution is the United States and a bunch of other countries saying, let's make our economy worse by giving a boatload of aid to other countries, then a realist would say, like, you gain nothing from that. You make your citizens worse. You make yourself weaker as a country. And so that would be a contention argument that you would make. So the distinction can be a little difficult. Let's talk about framework versus contention. So framework is the stuff that Joie was talking about. We care about our citizens, and that Lawrence was talking about the social contract. And then the contentions were some of the other stuff that Joie was talking about. We do not have obligations to other countries, and we make our citizens worse. And that second part is where realism comes in. Realism says trying to give stuff to other countries not only spends money we could spend on United States citizens, but also just like makes us weaker when we could be using that money to get stronger, which is like kind of the same thing, I guess. Okay, so let's talk about research. So number one is you should look up someone named John Mearsheimer. And Mearsheimer is very strange. If you type it into Google, like just like how it sounds, it should just come up. But Mearsheimer is Mearsheimer. So Mear, like Mear, and then Scheimer, except there's the E is before the I. So there's an Eimer. So Mearsheimer. Look up stuff on realism and the theory of international relations. A lot of this case you could sort of just write yourself about the social contract, but you could also look up John Mearsheimer and other people talking about him for his theories on realism, etc. And then for the contentions, you could also look up some of the same stuff about how it makes our country worse. Okay, so let's talk about two arguments against it. Joie, first one.
We should care about other people.
That sounds pretty reasonable.
Nah.
I can't believe I have to say this, but
Lawrence,
maybe.
haven't you ever heard that sharing is caring?
Yes, and then I disagreed with it.
You disagreed with it? That's so sad. So yes, we should care about other people. And by other people, Joie, you mean like other nation citizens, right?
Right.
So this kind of directly clashes with the Rawls argument, right? Because Rawls is like, the whole idea of like having special allegiance to your nation is stupid. because you weren't born there. And that's kind of the argument against this, right?
Yeah, basically.
Although the realists would also say that the Rawlsians are stupid. They're like, you can't just pretend that there aren't governments. What are you doing? I think one of the intuitions that this argument is trying to capture, this whole realism NC, is that the government does at least have kind of special obligations to its people. And the social contract helps establish that. But one way you can think about it and kind of use it to persuade a judge is that the relationship a government has with its people is kind of like the relationship that a parent has with its child. Like, obviously, there are other parents with other children, but your relationship with your children is special because they're your child. And I think that the resolution, or that, realism in general, and having specific obligations to your citizens, is trying to say that, like, the government's relationships with its own people is kind of special in that way. And then I think what Joie is saying is that other people, especially Rawlsians, would be like, no, the obligation isn't special at all. Okay, Lawrence, what's the second one? Second argument.
Yeah, so the second argument is that realist nations ought to have obligations to, or do have obligations to give to other places because it is in the self-interest to do so, sort of in a highly globalized economy, in a place of like interdependency and like where you trade with other people, and just like for a bunch of other reasons, like maybe reducing terrorism or whatever. It just seems like any nation that tries to be isolationist and like not give any money to anywhere else is actually failing their obligation of protecting their people and benefiting their people by isolating themselves from so many good things and actually like creating security threats for themselves. And so for the purposes of enhancing the world economy, for creating trade partners, for creating less unstable worlds that may arise in conflict or promote terrorism or instability or hurt crops or economy or whatever, anything else really, that realist governments have an obligation to provide development assistance for the sole purpose of strengthening their own country's security and prosperity.
Right. And I think that you hit on like one of the essential points, which is that like a government, like the international system is no longer like it was back when like an ocean was a reliable way of stopping a nation from attacking you. Right? Like the whole idea is that threats in other countries can become threats in this one, right? So the whole idea is that like our relationship with other countries should just be to plug our ears is just kind of very silly, right, Lawrence?
Well, I mean, you could try it, but I doubt it would work. So,
have you ever plugged your ears, Lawrence?
I do so every time you speak on the podcast.
Oh no, the shade! That was a good comeback, though. 10 out of 10. All right, let's go to the next negative position. So I have listened here as sovereignty. So before the sovereignty NC, before we get into how the resolution kind of affects sovereignty, first I want to talk about what sovereignty is. So sovereignty is kind of like a principle in international law. And what sovereignty basically says is that the way that a government, the reason that the government is able to command authority in international law. So if someone is like, I am a country in international law, why are you supposed to listen to a word that they say? And the basic idea of sovereignty is we listen to what they say because they're supposed to be speaking for a group of people. They're supposed to be representing a nation. If I was like, I am the nation of Sigalandia, population 1, right? The United Nations would be like, we don't care about you. There's no reason that you are even talking to us. I do not have sovereignty. But in the same sense, that it's because you speak for a group of people, you also have kind of rights. And what a sovereignty is, Lawrence, tell me if I'm wrong about this. My understanding of sovereignty, and maybe I haven't taken enough IR classes, is kind of that sovereignty says that because we are a government and you're supposed to speak for a group of people, sovereignty is kind of like the rights that your government has versus other governments.
Yeah, well, the rights that you have to power within a sort of set of boundaries over other governments, I guess might be a little bit more accurate.
Kind of like against other governments.
Yes, and yeah.
So what could another country do that might compromise your sovereignty?
They could probably invade you. That would probably suck.
Yeah, that would certainly suck. Invade. Well, why? Actually, well, then, sorry, not like why would it stink, but like why would it? Why is that a violation of sovereignty?
Well, because it would attempt to establish an external dominant power within a set of political boundaries that undermines the power of the current sovereign.
Okay, so it has something to do with control, right?
Yeah.
Sort of like the whole idea of sovereignty is like nations have a right to control themselves in much the same way that individuals within a society have rights to control themselves, right, Joey?
Yeah, right.
And sovereignty, I find, Joey, is kind of like a metaphor in that that's sort of the same
not
way.
another metaphor.
Oh, no. I just meant like sovereignty is a metaphor. Not that
What does that even mean?
because it kind of is, right? I mean, like, how does a piece of paper have rights?
Okay, fair.
So it's kind of like supposed to be like if you are not like nations in the UN act as if it's like one person inside of a society of like 130 people. They're like, my individual rights has been violated. These two people picked on me, right? I don't deserve to be treated this way. It sounds very much like kind of individual rightsy discussions.
Yeah, in a way.
Yeah, at least I think that that's how nations kind of think about them. Um, okay, so that's what sovereignty is, and basically, the kind of logical extent of that, Lawrence, is that sovereignty is kind of like respecting government rights. So a lot of your criterion arguments are about why it is important for governments to have rights to things like territorial integrity and to be able to do what they want.
Yeah, so within reason, obviously, like I don't think sovereignty extends to the right of like murdering your own people for fun, but
Well, I actually think that that is contentious because like that is actually the key point in sovereignty that people disagree with. Like because that actually happens very very frequently. Like when a country like does bad stuff to its own people, and then the United Nations is like, "Yo, stop doing that," and then like the government is like, "Don't violate my sovereignty, bro."
yeah, but then like you think a little bit about what the basis of sovereignty is, and you're like, wait, that really doesn't seem to go so far to justify you murdering your own people for funsies. I think it's a little bit more contentious in this area though of the topic because the topic isn't like alleviate humanitarian disaster, like if the government sent its own troops to murder its people. It's like this country's just a little bit poor, and that sort of begs the question of whether or not like that somehow sacrifices the sovereignty of a state to allow other external actors to interfere.
Yeah, so why don't we just jump straight in then to this? So what exactly is the argument for why development assistance violates sovereignty? Because obviously if I'm just like, "Hey Lawrence, here's $50," and you're like, "Oh, my rights." Like obviously like I didn't really do anything to you. So what are the people that say that development assistance violates sovereignty? Like what are they saying?
So I guess that most of it is like um, when you give assistance and sort of condition it on something, uh, specifically like anything that might have to do with something that would benefit the donor's interests. So, for example, if you gave someone money for the purpose of economic development, and you were like, as a result, you're going to become really good trading partners with me. Well, that seems to violate sovereignty a little bit because it sort of is attempting to undermine the authority of the sovereign to sort of do what they please by putting them and subjecting them to the will of an external actor who is conditioning this aid based off of a set of responses that they want. And that seems to undermine like the total control and authority that the sovereign is supposed to have.
This raises a very interesting question. I think that's exactly the argument people make. And I want to really get into this because I actually think this is a super interesting topic. By the way, I don't know if I've said this yet. This topic looks awesome. It looks so good. Like there's so many sweet cases. I think the rounds I'm going to judge on this topic are going to be awesome. Quick aside, Joey, Lawrence, what do you all think about the topic? I think it looks amazing.
Yeah, it's fine.
It's fine.
My thoughts exactly.
It's so cool. You can talk about sovereignty and international laws and veils of ignorance. No, I love it. Not that I'm ever going to judge any actual debates with any of these arguments in them. But a man can dream. Okay, so juicy question then in sovereignty, Joey. So can something violate your sovereignty even if you consent to it? Because I think that is actually a critical question, because basically what Lawrence is saying is like, hey, if someone offers you stuff and you agree to do it voluntarily, but then it kind of like messes up your own control over your country's economic system, that some people think that's still a violation of sovereignty. Whereas I'm sure some other people would be like, but you chose to do it.
Yeah,
You know?
I would say.
What do you think?
I would say, if it compromises your control over like your own country or your own state, then yeah, I think there's definitely, like, I think you could definitely say that that's like violating your sovereignty. But then again, it depends on what side of the debate you're on.
Yeah, exactly.
It definitely makes a lot of intuitive sense to be like, if you're giving me money and I want the money and I'm using the money to improve my country, it's like it intuitively makes sense that that isn't a bad thing, and that isn't like violating your sovereignty.
Right, exactly. One analogy that kind of comes up to me, for me here, is kind of like the idea of selling yourself into slavery. Because the whole idea of selling yourself into slavery is like, you can voluntarily choose to become a slave. That is a choice you can make. But that choice still harms freedom, even though you chose to do it. So in a way, I think countries can choose to have their sovereignty violated. Also, another thing, and maybe Lawrence, you can weigh in on this. Is there an argument that you can make also that development assistance violates sovereignty regardless of its consequences, because it's like nations are kind of trying to change other countries?
Yeah, I guess you could say that. I think it's a little bit weaker if it's not sort of conditioned aid. But
Well, yeah,
even
yeah,
if it
yeah.
even if it's not
Yeah.
conditioned, yeah, I do think you could say like, yeah, you're attempting to change the country, but it's a little bit weird to think that like if there was no conditions attached to it and someone's just like, here's some money, like improve yourself, you're like, how dare you? It seems a little bit weak.
So I'm not talking about like the type of aid. So let's say that the aid was conditioned, maybe it was a loan. My point is like, there's a point of like kind of the intention of it, which we talked a lot about when we talked about the definition of development assistance. The whole point of development assistance is like, you are giving this to someone because you want them to change the fundamental nature of their economy. And there is a way in which that kind of like, I don't know, that the kind of desire that is inherent in that is kind of sovereignty violating, or do we not care about that? Okay, I think we've gone too deep.
Maybe I don't know, personally not, but you know.
Okay. So how do you research it? So international law stuff about sovereignty, this whole development assistance sovereignty stuff, this whole aid and sovereignty is a really rich question and debate in journal articles in international law. So I highly recommend looking up those things straight up. This will probably not be a topic where regular Google is useful for you. This will probably be like law-y articles that you can use our research podcast to try and find. And then stuff about why sovereignty is important. We kind of talked about that. Most of that will have to be done not through evidence, but for your own personal arguments. But you can find some evidence for it. All right, so the third negative argument, and I understand that we're pretty long on time, but we have some really sweet arguments that we all wanted to talk about and kind of educate you on. So if this podcast runs a little longer than normal, I apologize. If you like the longer podcast, please let us know at the argumentclubpodcast@gmail.com. But if you'd like us to shorten them, that would also be something that we can maybe do. Also let us know, and I'm also lengthening the podcast right now. Okay, so third argument is aid dependency. I wanted to mention this because it's in the literature a lot. So aid dependency is basically the argument that the more development assistance you try and give to a nation, the more like it kind of doesn't really develop the nation very much. Instead, what it does is the nation just becomes incredibly reliant on your source of aid. So, Lawrence, this kind of reminds me of I don't remember where this comes from. It was like probably the Bible or something, but it was this whole like give a man a fish, he eats for a day. Teach a man to fish, he eats for the rest of his life. Like, can you kind of explain that and the relevance to this argument?
Is it from the Bible? I have no idea where that's from.
I have no clue.
Anyways, so the basic idea is that if we give too much aid to people, then what happens is they sort of just take the aid and they don't really learn how to sort of grow and develop on their own. And it sort of takes over local independence and the development of industries that would benefit the local economy. And instead of learning how to grow and like develop on their own, they just rely on money from outside. And that means that as soon as the money goes away, they don't know what to do because they don't have an economy capable of generating money that benefits that local economy. And that does sort of seem to harm those people locally because they can't be forever reliant on outside money.
Okay, so Joey, this is going to be a real softball question for you, but what sort of framework are we looking at here?
Generally just like a utilitarianism basic sort of framework.
Yeah, this is all about those externalities, how development assistance backfires, all those consequences stuff that we talked about. Consequentialism could be structural violence, but it'll probably be something like utilitarianism. You make the country you make the country worse. This is the way that it's kind of maybe useful to think about aid dependency, and a lot of people do talk about it. Is like, what is the point of development assistance? Like, most of the time, it's to try and get a country to a place where, as Joey said in the beginning, where the country is independent, right? Where it's self-sufficient. So the whole idea is that development assistance kind of fails in that task because it prevents countries from being independent. It makes them dependent on us. Like, at least before the development assistance, they were their own countries. And now they're kind of just like proxies for United States countries. One quick derivation that I want to talk about is there's this stuff about kind of bureaucracy. And let me know if you all have come across this argument in your readings. But one of the arguments that I found was that when governments set up development assistance with target nations, what happens is the target nations devote a bunch of bureaucratic time with the couple of skilled people they have in the country, and those people spend all of their time trying to make donors happy, to try and make it look like they're doing good stuff. And then, they get sucked up in meetings and things like that. And then they don't actually help out their country. Like, it puts an emphasis kind of on like writing reports than it does on governing your country. Is that consistent, Lawrence, with the stuff that you found? I found a bunch of stuff about bureaucracy.
Yeah, seems about right to me.
Yeah, okay. So we've talked about the framework. So how do you research it? Honestly, regular Google, your friend. Google Scholar also works, but regular Google really like just has a bunch of articles. Like, if you type just like development assistance negative consequences, you'll just like get articles where people are like, development assistance causes dependency on aid. Like, this is, and if you type aid dependency, like that's a real argument. Tons of people write about it. Okay, two arguments against aid dependency. One is kind of in an empirical sense, so that aid dependency just like doesn't actually exist. So Lawrence, you would go to Google Scholar and stuff for things like that, right?
Yeah. It's not that hard to find some people that are just like aid dependency is sort of overblown, especially if you do, like, if, for example, if a country institutes or implements development assistance properly, then it's not that hard to design a program that doesn't cause people to be incentivized to be dependent on that aid. So, for example, if you condition that aid on sort of benchmarks, so like you need to like do X in your economy in order to get this money, that sort of solves some of the problems of being dependent. Or if like this development assistance is only used in conjunction with the local program, so like it doesn't start a new program, but only helps a program that they've already done. So for example, if like maybe you're trying to boost development assistance in like a farming sector. It's not like you're creating a new sector that they'd be relying on, but just boosting an already existing sector. So just a bunch of different small things that you can do when implementing development assistance that helps mitigate the harms of aid dependency.
Definitely. And last thing, Joey. So last argument against development assistance. My understanding of this is that some people say that aid dependency like isn't that bad, or like aid dependency just isn't worse than what's happening right now. Can you kind of give us a sense of why people might think that like the literal thing happening right now might be worse than quote unquote aid dependency?
Yeah, I mean, I think the obvious argument there is that it's better for them to be like dependent on us, especially like with the US where we have plenty of extra resources, than for them to just be like living in poverty in really terrible conditions.
Right, exactly. It's like, sure, they're dependent on us, but they like, like have food. Like that's
Yeah,
good.
exactly.
Okay. So that's all the negative arguments. When we get back, we will have our mini debate. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Argument Clinic podcast. This was a really great TA with the fabulous Joie Otting. Joey, you were awesome. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Is there any way? Yeah. Is there any way that those who? So I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast that Joie is available to you, should you so choose, as a resource for the upcoming topic and beyond. She's looking to get back involved in debate and stuff like that. So Joey, can you just talk for just a little bit about how, if that's a thing that interests some of our listeners, how they might go about contacting you, etc.?
Yeah, you can find me on Facebook. My name should be in the description somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And my email is ottingjo@gmail. My last name, OTTINGJO@gmail.com. And you can find me there as well.
Okay, awesome. All right, so I'd like to go ahead and thank Victory Briefs again. Victory Briefs is an excellent sponsor of the podcast. They're our premier debate camp. Thank you so much for sponsoring us. Thank you so much, Joey, for coming on the podcast. Now, the only important topic of conversation, the mini debate. So, Lawrence, let's talk Halloween candy. So Halloween is right around the corner. What is your favorite item of Halloween candy? My favorite, or at least it used to be, I haven't actually like gone to Halloween in some time, but when I used to do the whole trick-or-treating, the thing that I would care about the most is Three Musketeers. Those are my favorite. So I loved how creamy they were. They were excellent. I just love the consistency of them. I thought that they were better than every other kind of candy bar for Halloween. So my vote is for Three Musketeers. And now, what is your vote for Halloween candy?
Oh, shoot. That's such a good question. So, I mean, like, I don't personally like Three Musketeers, but I can see why someone would. I'd say either jelly beans or Kit Kats. So
let's go with Kit Kats just because they're like kind of similar to Three Musketeers.
Oh, okay. Yeah, how are you supposed to rank between these sort of like subjective preferences that people have? There's not like what's like the ranking scale, you know?
I love how the I do like Kit Kats, but I love how the Milky Ways were kind of like richer and kind of like more interesting. Maybe that's an argument against Three Musketeers. But like, what would be your argument in favor of Kit Kats?
I don't have one. They taste good. I don't have strong opinions on this. Like, there's
come on.
I can't even go online, and like the best I've got is this list of, it's like a breakdown of the worst Halloween candy, but like that's it. And like obviously I think just candy corn's just like the worst Halloween candy.
That's definitely true. Can we get some consensus on that real fast?
Yeah, it's just
candy corn's terrible.
Candy corn is awful. When I was a kid, I would have candy corn. I would be like, this is terrible. And then like I would see people eating it like a lot. And then like the next year I'm like, everyone's eating it, it can't be that bad. And I try it again and be like, this is still terrible. Why do people eat this? I don't get it.
Yeah, I clearly think there's just like there's no explanation for why candy corn is popular. Like other than the fact that people have just like maybe there's just like some giant conspiracy where like people like they pay a bunch of people to eat candy corn every so often, and like other people see them eat it and they're like, man, it can't be that bad, and they eat it and they're like, oh, that's so bad. But like
wait. Is it wait. I just had the most conspiracy theory thing ever. And now I'm gonna Google this because I wanna figure it out. Okay. In the meantime, Joey, you should weigh in on which one you think is better, Kit Kats or Three Musketeers. You will decide the Halloween candy Martin v. Lawrence debate.
Wait, that was supposed to be a debate?
Yeah, well, I mean, Lawrence didn't make any arguments.
How are you supposed to make arguments about this? Like, there's an argument to be made
did.
Best berry, I guess, but like best Halloween candy. Like, what are you supposed to say about that? It's all good. It's candy. It's the only thing that's not good is candy corn.
Come on. So even though Lawrence didn't put up a fight, I'll give him the benefit of the doubt. What do you think is best, Joey, in your opinion?
Okay.
Kit Kat or Three Musketeers?
I have a few reasons actually why I think Kit Kats are best.
No, the 2-1. Okay,
but
sorry,
I actually have reasons. The first is that Kit Kats are more entertaining to eat. The second is that they're different from other candies. Like Milky Ways and Three Musketeers and Snickers all have like sort of the same filling with different stuff added to it, but Kit Kats are like their own thing. And then the third one is obviously that they're crunchy, which makes them better.
Those are actually very strong arguments. Like definitely the experience argument, the crunchy argument is good. I really think that this is a 1-1 split though. I'm not even going to count Lawrence. Lawrence didn't make any arguments, no warrants at all. But I will definitely concede defeat just to those 3 Kit Kats arguments alone.
All right,
that's pretty much how I won.
Hey, okay, awesome. You argued that crunchy things were better, and I assume that was a key component of your finals debate. But
yeah.
All right. Thank you everyone for listening. Joey, we have a thing on this podcast that we say at the end. Could you say in kind of like a loud, ostentatious way, could you say, stay frosty?
Stay frosty? That's what you want me to say?
Yep.
But louder and with more enthusiasm.
Yeah.
Okay.
Like, ignore how silly and stupid the phrase is and say it.
Stupid! How dare you? Anyway, go on.
Okay. Stay frosty.
This isn't an argument.
Yes, it is.
No, it isn't. It's just contradiction.
No, it isn't.
Yes, it is.
It is not.